Russia overnight launched its long-anticipated attack on Ukraine, striking military posts across the country.
They mobilized before dawn, pouring across Ukraine's borders from multiple directions.
Russian troops are closing in on the capital. Their military vehicles have been filmed entering the city. And in the last few hours, multiple explosions have been reported.
As I make this video today, Russia and Ukraine are at war. It is a humanitarian tragedy, and people of both the countries are suffering. Further, it can have dire consequences, not only for the countries at war, but also for the rest of the world. In this globalized world, countries are interconnected and interdependent with respect to economy, trade, and finances. And on this video, we will be discussing the economic consequences of war as seen historically and in the current Russia-Ukraine war situation. A quick introduction about myself. I am Ayushi. I am an Indian Economic Service Officer and I am currently working with the Government of India. I have over 7 years of experience in the fields of economics, finance and public policy. 1929 was the worst economic depression period in modern history. There was crippling unemployment and a decline in worldwide GDP by over 15%. To put things into perspective, the 2008 mortgage crisis and the ensuing recession caused a drop in worldwide GDP by just 1%. So you can imagine how bad the situation was during the 1930s. But how did the world come out of this depression? Students of economics or history or those familiar with the concept of GDP will probably say, well, that the world recovered because of World War II. Because of World War II, a huge number of factories were built, arms and ammunition were manufactured, people were employed, infrastructure projects were funded, and governments threw their budgets aside to provide the largest fiscal stimulus ever in order to win the war. I have discussed in my previous video, government expenditure can boost the GDP of a country. I have linked the video on the top and it can help you understand about fiscal policy and Keynesian economics and how government expenditure can boost the GDP. Similarly, if we go back a few years to the World War I, when the war began, the US economy was in recession. But a 44-month economic boom ensued from 1914 to 1918. First, as Europe began to purchase goods from US and later as the United States itself joined the war. There was also a massive US federal spending and production shifted from civilian goods to war-related goods. The GDP started increasing and companies which were involved in the manufacture of arms saw a rise in demand and profit. Further, between 1914 and 1918, around 3 million people were added to the military and 500,000 to the government. Workers were drawn into new manufacturing jobs. Young men had to join the military. The overall unemployment declined from 7.9% to 1.4% in this period. Thus, you notice the two world wars led to a situation of improving GDP and decreasing unemployment. Both are considered as signs of a healthy economy. Further, some studies have also pointed towards increased rate of innovation as the government invests in new technology. For example, development of radar or jet engine during the Second World War. There is also noticed to be a change in social attitudes. For example, women started entering labor market after the First World War. But the issue is that the negative aspects outweigh the positive aspects massively. The economics of war are just as true today as they were back in the 1930s and the 1940s. A situation like war can lead to rapid manufacturing and lowering of unemployment in the short term. However, these indicators can be extremely misleading. Ultimately, GDP only measures the value of goods and services produced in an economy in a specific time period. It does not measure other important factors such as the toll on human health, the lack of education, and the effect on productivity. It would not measure how different sectors are affected due to a war or whether the expenditure made by the government are good for the economy. It also does not indicate how the spending could have been done in a more prudent manner in sectors which could have reaped longer-term benefits for the economy and its people. And hence, GDP can be a very, very misleading measure. As Robert Kennedy, a former Attorney General of USA said, GDP measures everything except for that which is worthwhile. Thus, focusing only on the GDP can be very misleading. Similarly, in case of employment, the employment figures would not give an assessment of how productively the people are employed or whether they're satisfied with their current employment. And hence, these indicators only give an indication of where the economy is heading. It does not give a true measure of the well-being of an economy. Now, let us see what are the actual costs of war in economic terms. First are what are called as opportunity cost, or what could have been. It has been seen that GDP figures do actually increase during periods of war, but it is a classic example of the broken window fallacy. This means that if you break a window and pay someone $20 to replace the window, the GDP has effectively increased by $20 and you have created a new job. But is this actually economic prosperity? No. Repairing the broken window doesn't increase the overall output. It merely shifts an economy from productive output to maintaining the existing situation. When we talk about the economic benefits of war, we must be aware of the broken window fallacy. When we spend money on the war, this creates demand, but also it represents a huge opportunity cost. Rather than building bombs and rebuilding destroyed towns, we could have used this money to improve the education or healthcare. Moreover, post-war rebuilding will have multiple maintenance costs, which further depresses the production of consumer goods and services. If a government spends an extra $3 billion on military spending, that is the $3 billion that could have been spent in building hospitals and schools for kids. According to a report by the Watson Institute, the cost of the Iraq war was $2 trillion US. This $2 trillion could equally have been spent on more constructive development projects. The conclusion is that countries would be much better off not fighting at all. Second, inflation. In many circumstances, wars can lead to inflation, which leads to a loss of people's savings, rise in uncertainty, and loss of confidence in the financial system. For example, in the US Civil War, the country struggled financially to meet the cost of the war. Therefore, they started printing money to pay soldiers' salaries. But as they printed more money, the value of money soon declined. High inflation hits middle-income savers like you and I the most, as they see that the value of their savings is being wiped out. During the Second World War, the United States saw a rise in inflation because the economy was running close to full capacity. The high levels of government spending and shortage of workers saw inflationary pressures. During war, the economy can also experience a cost-push inflation due to shortages of goods and services and rising prices of raw materials like oil. If a country is devastated by war and the capacity to produce goods is sharply reduced, it can create the circumstances of hyperinflation as governments desperately print money to try and deal with lack of goods. For example, with the devastated economy in 1946, Hungary and Austria experienced the highest rates of hyperinflation on record. I have discussed how printing money and an excess money supply in the economy can lead to inflation in my video. I have linked it on the top. Do go and watch it. Third is a rise in oil prices. Wars can often lead to higher prices of oil because major conflict can threaten supplies. For example, the Gulf War of 1990 led to rising oil prices. Prices rose from $21 a barrel to $46 a barrel within 3 months. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine led to a rise in the price of oil and gas, and this is going to lead to higher global prices for fuel. As Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas, economic sanctions on Russia in response to the invasion will also reduce supply and put upward pressure on gas prices. This might increase prices in a lot of countries across the world. Fourth, increase in national debt. During war, we often see a rapid rise in public sector debt. The government is willing to borrow a lot more than usual because there is patriotic support for the war effort and they need to finance the expenditures on war. Both the First and the Second World Wars were very costly for the UK. In both cases, the national debt rose very sharply. In the post-war period, debt continued to rise because of reconstruction activities. And hence, the UK national debt rose to 150% at the end of World War II, but then rose to 240% by the early 1950s. The UK relied on loans from the US during the Second World War and took many decades to pay them off. When the national debt rises, it can threaten the financial system as investors start pulling out their money. Sovereign risk rises, and getting more loans for future expenditures becomes difficult. I have discussed all these details in my previous video on sovereign risk. Please do watch it. The next point is about the cost of a war. Wars can have a devastating impact on the economic development of countries which are engaged in the war. Countries experiencing civil war will see a collapse in tourism, foreign investment, and domestic investment. It can lead to shorter life expectancy and a lost GDP. A report entitled Africa's Missing Billions by Oxfam estimates that the cost of war in Africa has been equal to the amount of international aid it has received. A country like the Democratic Republic of Congo has experienced a particularly difficult war, which, besides causing the death of about 4 million people, has cost it 9 billion euros or 29% of its GDP. The report also notes that ongoing war and increased availability of weapons can lead to increase in rates of armed violence and organized crime. And finally, the most important point is about the humanitarian costs. It is possible to estimate the economic costs of war, cost of military, cost on arms, etc. However, it is harder to estimate the psychological costs of war, the pain of death, suffering, fear, and disability. A conflict can leave people, both soldiers and civilians, traumatized for the rest of their lives. Wars come to an end, but the people who have had to face the war, who lose their loved ones, suffer for the rest of their lives. This is something which cannot be quantified and cannot be accounted for while calculating the costs of a war. Thus, GDP and employment, which are considered to be economic indicators for the prosperity of a nation, may present a very positive or very rosy picture about the country at war. However, these are very misleading. They do not present the real picture. They do not talk about the pain and suffering of the people and where that money could have been spent in order to better the lives of the people of that country. And hence, in this hour of need, we must stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and hope and pray for a peaceful future for all of us. With this, I conclude today's video. I wanted to present an economic aspect of war, not forgetting the humanitarian or the psychological aspects that war brings for its people. I hope you like the video. If you like the video, then do press the like button. I will see you the next time with more case studies. And till then, take care, stay safe, bye.